The air was thick with the scent of burning coal and oppression. The streets of Montgomery lined with signs that dictated where a man like Henry could and could not stand, sit, or simply exist. He had learned early on that the wrong step, the wrong look, the wrong breath in the wrong place could mean a beating or worse. It was 1947, and though the war had ended overseas, here at home, the battle never ceased. His mother had always told him to keep his head down, to work hard, to make himself invisible, but Henry had never been good at swallowing the fire in his chest. He walked with his back straight, his jaw clenched, daring the world to see him, daring the world to acknowledge his humanity, even as it spat in his face. He had a job sweeping floors at a downtown department store, a place where white women in crisp dresses and pearl necklaces never looked him in the eye, where the manager barely spoke to him except to bark orders. He hated it, but jobs were scarce, and his mother's health was failing. Every night, as he walked the long road back to the colored side of town, he felt the weight of a city pressing against his lungs, waiting for him to break. Then, one evening, something changed. It started with a sound, an unfamiliar voice, soft but clear, calling his name. He turned and saw her, Margaret Whitmore, the daughter of the department store owner, standing in the alley beside the building. She was supposed to be untouchable, unreachable, but there she was, looking at him as if she had something to say. His pulse quickened. No good could come from a white woman seeking him out, not in this world. "You forgot this," she said, holding out a handkerchief he didn't recognize. He hesitated, searching her face for the cruel joke, the hidden danger, but found only nervous sincerity. Against every instinct, he took it. From that moment, his life unraveled. They spoke in hushed voices behind the store, brief moments stolen in the shadows where no eyes could pry. She was unlike anyone he had ever known, her curiosity about his world both frustrating and endearing. She had never ridden in the back of a bus, never been refused service, never felt the sting of a slur spat like poison. And yet, she listened. She wanted to know. And worse, she wanted to change things. "It isn't fair," she whispered one evening. "None of it." Henry laughed bitterly. "You just now noticing?" She flinched but didn't look away. "I want to help." The words made his chest tighten with something between anger and longing. Help? There was no help, no way out, no justice waiting at the end of this road. But still, he let her in. He let himself believe, just for a moment, that maybe she was different, that maybe things could change. He let himself imagine a world where he could walk beside her in the daylight, where he could take her hand without fear of death. It was a foolish dream, and he knew it. He knew it the night they were seen. A white man, Margaret's father's business partner, caught them standing too close, speaking too softly, and by morning, Henry's world had crumbled. He was fired without explanation. His landlord suddenly found reason to evict his family, and worse, whispers had begun to spread. The kind of whispers that got men like him strung up from trees. Margaret begged him to leave town, to run before it was too late. "I'll come with you," she swore, eyes wide with desperation. But Henry knew better. There was nowhere safe. And yet, when the night came and the torches flickered outside his home, he had no choice. He ran. The road was long, the fear a living thing in his throat, but Margaret was there, gripping his hand so tightly he thought his bones might break. They made it as far as Birmingham before reality caught up to them. The bus station was crowded, loud, filled with the scent of sweat and exhaust, but it was the silence that struck him first, the way the white men near the entrance stiffened, the way their eyes darkened with knowing. Margaret must have seen it, too, because her grip on his hand faltered. "Go," she whispered, but Henry stood frozen, knowing there was no escape. The police arrived within minutes. He never saw her again. The trial was a formality, the kind where justice was never an option. They called it an assault, a crime against decency, though he had never laid a hand on her. The judge didn't even look at him when he spoke the verdict, 10 years in Parchment Farm. A sentence that might as well have been death. In the prison camps, time lost meaning. The sun beat down on his back as he picked cotton for men who saw him as nothing more than property. He thought of his mother, alone now, sick and dying. He thought of Margaret, safe in a house built on blood, a house he would never see again. But mostly, he thought of the way the world had made sure he never stood a chance. Then, one day, a letter arrived. Smuggled in through a guard, who still had a sliver of a soul, it was written in the shaky hand of a woman who had defied everything to reach him. "I never stopped looking for you," it read, "and I never will." Henry stared at the words, his hands trembling. For the first time in years, he let himself hope. Henry traced the fragile ink of Margaret's words with shaking fingers, the edges of the letter already curling from the damp heat of the prison barracks, his breath unsteady as he read the lines again and again. "I never stopped looking for you. And I never will." It was impossible. It had to be. He had convinced himself she was gone, buried beneath the weight of the life she was born into, swallowed by the world that had tried to erase him. But now, after all these years, she was reaching for him through the bars that held him in place, through the distance that had turned his soul into something brittle, something hollow. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it beneath a thin mattress that smelled of sweat and despair, swallowing the sudden, sharp ache in his throat. He could not afford hope, not here, not now. Hope had only ever brought pain. He had learned that the hard way, the first time his body had crumpled under the weight of a guard's baton, the first time he had seen another man carried out of the barracks, lifeless, forgotten. And yet, as he lay in the dark that night, the letter a hidden warmth against his skin, something in him stirred, something dangerous and undeniable. Days passed in the slow, brutal rhythm of labor, the sun carving into his back as he worked the endless fields, his hands raw, his shoulders screaming. He moved without thought, without feeling, a ghost of the man he once was. But in the quiet moments, when the world stilled and the weight of exhaustion settled in his bones, he thought of Margaret. He thought of the way she had looked at him all those years ago, unafraid, unwavering. He thought of the way her voice had trembled when she told him to run. He thought of her hands, warm and desperate, gripping his as they fled into the night. And then he thought of the letter. There was no return address, no way to write back, no way to know where she was or how she had found him. But she had. Against all odds, against the silence the world had tried to place between them, she had found him. And that meant she was still fighting. And if she was fighting, so would he. It started with a whisper. A quiet conversation in the dead of night, hushed voices between bunks. Men who had been here longer than him, men who had seen things too terrible to name. They spoke of the ones who had made it out, the ones who had disappeared into the night and never been found. There were stories, rumors, nothing more, but Henry held on to them like a drowning man to driftwood. Escape was impossible. That's what they wanted them to believe. But Henry had spent his entire life fighting against the impossible. And now, with the ghost of Margaret's words burning in his mind, he knew he had to try. The plan came together in stolen moments, in looks exchanged across the fields, in coded words muttered under breath. There were others like him, men who had nothing left to lose, men who had watched their brothers die in chains and refused to meet the same fate. They moved carefully, waiting for the right moment, the right night, the right storm to cover their tracks. And when it came, when the sky split open with thunder and the rain turned the earth into slick, shifting mud, they ran. It was chaos. Guards shouting, dogs barking, gunfire cracking through the air. Henry ran faster than he ever had, his legs screaming, his lungs burning, the night swallowing him whole. He did not look back. He could not. He did not know how many had made it, how many had fallen, how many names would be whispered in morning come morning. He only knew that he was still running, still moving, still breathing. And then the trees closed around him, and the shouts faded, and he was free. But freedom was just another kind of prison. The world outside was no safer than the one he had left behind. He was a fugitive now, a wanted man, his face a warning in every newspaper, his name a curse on the lips of those who had put him in chains. He could not stay in one place for long, could not rest, could not trust. Every shadow held danger, every stranger a possible betrayal. But he had something stronger than fear. He had a name. He had a promise. Margaret. He moved through the South like a ghost, slipping between towns, working just long enough to earn passage to the next, always listening, always searching. Months passed in a blur of hunger and exhaustion, of near misses and narrow escapes, of nights spent staring at the sky and wondering if she was looking at the same stars. And then, finally, he found her. New Orleans. A boarding house on the edge of the French Quarter, a place where people disappeared into new names and new lives. He saw her before she saw him, her hair tucked beneath a scarf, her hands steady as she counted coins behind the counter. She looked different, older, harder. But when she turned, when her eyes met his, everything else fell away. "Henry!" she breathed, and suddenly he was home. But home was dangerous. They had only minutes before the world came crashing down around them. She had been waiting for him, searching for him, but she had not been safe. They would come for them both now. They had to run. Again. Always. But this time, they would not stop. This time, they would not look back. This time, they would disappear together. And maybe, just maybe, they would finally be free. Henry grasped Margaret's hand, their fingers locking together with the desperation of two people who had spent too long lost in the dark, two people who had spent their entire lives running, surviving, but never truly living. The room was small, dimly lit by a single flickering candle, but he could see her clearly, every line etched into her face, every shadow that time had carved beneath her eyes. She looked tired, but she looked strong, and when she pulled him closer, pressing her forehead against his, he could feel the weight of every year they had spent apart, the weight of every sacrifice, every risk, every loss. But there was no time to mourn what had been stolen from them. Outside, the city pulsed with danger, the streets alive with watchful eyes, whispers that carried their names, footsteps that could mean capture, or worse. Margaret had built a life here, hidden herself in the cracks of the world, but Henry's presence had shattered the fragile illusion of safety she had managed to create. He should have felt guilt, but all he felt was an overwhelming, relentless need to hold on to her, to protect her, to make sure that this time, no one could take her from him. "We have to go," she whispered, her breath warm against his cheek. He nodded, swallowing hard, because he had known this moment would come. He had spent months moving from town to town, never stopping, never staying, always looking over his shoulder. He had seen what happened to men like him when they let their guard down. He had watched them disappear, their names erased, their stories left unfinished. That would not be his fate. That would not be her fate. She led him through the back alleys, her steps quick, precise, practiced. She had been planning for this. She had known, somehow, that he would come for her. The thought sent a sharp ache through his chest, something dangerously close to hope. They reached the docks just before dawn, the Mississippi stretching wide and endless before them, the water black and shimmering beneath the first pale hints of morning. A boat waited, a man standing in the shadows, his face hidden beneath the brim of a worn hat. "You got the money?" His voice was rough, cautious. Margaret nodded, pressing a small bundle of bills into his waiting hand. "We need to be gone before the city wakes up," she said. The man counted quickly, nodded once, and gestured toward the boat. "You sure about this?" he asked, his eyes shifting between them. "Ain't no coming back once you cross." Henry met Margaret's gaze, saw the unspoken answer there. They had no choice. "We're sure," Henry said, his voice steady. The boat rocked beneath them as they stepped on board, the wood creaking softly, the air thick with the smell of the river. As they pulled away from the shore, New Orleans faded into the mist, swallowed by the rising sun, and for the first time in years, Henry felt something close to freedom. But freedom was never that simple. The river carried them south, winding through the bayou, through tangled trees and water thick with secrets. Days passed in a blur of heat and whispered fears, the tension never leaving their bodies, the knowledge that one wrong step, one wrong word, could mean the end. The boat left them in a small town on the edge of nowhere, a place where names could be changed and pasts could be buried, but the weight of their history clung to them like a second skin. Margaret found work as a seamstress, stitching quiet dreams into fabric, keeping her head down, her voice soft. Henry worked the docks, his hands calloused, his back aching, but it was honest work, and for a while, it was enough. For a while, they almost believed they could be safe. But safety was an illusion. The past was never far behind. One evening, as the sky burned red with the last light of day, Henry saw the man watching him from the edge of the docks, a newspaper folded beneath his arm, his eyes sharp, calculating. Henry felt the blood drain from his face. He knew that look, knew what it meant. The man turned, disappearing into the crowd, but Henry knew it was only a matter of time. He rushed home, his heart pounding, finding Margaret in the small rented room where they had carved out a fragile existence. "They found us," he said, the words heavy with finality. She didn't ask how. She didn't need to. She had always known this day would come. They packed quickly, moving with the urgency of people who had done this before, people who had learned the hard way that hesitation was a death sentence. But this time, it was different. This time, Margaret hesitated. "Henry," she said, her voice trembling, "I can't keep running." He stopped, his hand stilling over the worn fabric of a travel bag. "What are you saying?" She took a step closer, her hands gripping his. "I can't live my whole life looking over my shoulder. I want a home. I want a life. With you." His throat tightened. He had spent so long running, he had never let himself dream of stopping. "They won't let us have that," he said quietly. "They never have." She lifted her chin, something fierce in her eyes. "Then we take it." He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe in a world where love was stronger than hate, where they could carve out a place for themselves without fear. But he had seen too much. He had lost too much. "How?" he asked, the question raw. She pressed something into his hand. "A ticket. One way. North. We start over," she whispered. "We stop being who they say we are. We become something new." He looked down at the ticket, his heart pounding. A new life. A new name. A new chance. But the past was still out there, waiting. And Henry knew deep down that the past never let go without a fight. Henry gripped the ticket in his hand, feeling the weight of everything it represented: freedom, escape, a chance to live without fear, but also the crushing reality that starting over didn't mean the past would stop chasing them. He looked at Margaret, saw the determination in her eyes, the same fire that had kept her alive all these years, and knew he couldn't let her down. If she believed they could outrun this, if she believed they could build a life where no one would ever come looking for them, then he had to believe it too. The train station was a blur of bodies and hurried voices, the heavy scent of coal smoke mixing with the damp night air. Henry pulled his hat lower, his grip on Margaret's hand tightening as they weaved through the crowd. Every glance felt like a warning, every shadow a threat, but they kept moving, kept pushing forward. The train was already huffing steam, the great iron beast waiting to swallow them up and spit them out somewhere new. The ticket agent barely spared them a glance as Henry slid the crumpled stubs across the counter, his heart hammering as he waited for some sign that they had been caught. But the man just nodded, handed them back with a grunt, and pointed them toward the platform. Margaret let out a breath she had been holding. They stepped onto the train, the wooden floors creaking beneath their feet, and found a seat near the back, tucked away from the watchful eyes of the other passengers. The whistle blew, sharp and final. The wheels groaned against the tracks. And then they were moving, rolling away from the only life they had ever known, leaving behind the ghosts that had haunted them for so long. Henry didn't relax, not yet. He kept his eyes on the doors, watching, waiting. But as the city lights faded into darkness, as the steady rhythm of the train settled into something almost comforting, he let himself breathe. Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder, her fingers laced with his. "We made it," she whispered, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe she might be right. The train carried them north, through rolling hills and endless fields, through towns that blurred together, places they would never call home. They spoke little, both lost in their own thoughts, in the weight of what they had left behind. Henry wondered if the men hunting them would ever stop looking, if they would ever truly be safe. Margaret stared out the window, her reflection flickering against the glass, and he knew she was thinking about everything they had lost, about the people they had been before the world tried to break them. Days passed in a haze of movement and uncertainty. When they finally arrived in Chicago, the city loomed before them, vast and unfamiliar, the streets alive with motion, the air thick with the promise of something new. They found a small apartment in a neighborhood where no one asked questions, where people understood what it meant to leave a past behind. Henry found work in a factory, his hands blistered from long hours, his back aching from the weight of it, but it was honest work, work that let him come home to Margaret each night, work that meant they could eat, could keep the roof over their heads. Margaret stitched dresses for women who never looked her in the eye, who spoke to her like she was invisible, but she held her head high, her hands steady, her heart unbroken. They built a life in the cracks of the city, in the quiet spaces between the noise, always careful, always watching. But for the first time, they weren't running. They were still afraid, but they were together, and that was enough. For a while. But the past has long fingers, and secrets have a way of finding the light. One evening, as the first snow of winter dusted the streets, Henry stepped into a corner store to buy bread, his mind lost in the simple pleasure of routine, of normalcy. And then he saw the newspaper. His breath caught in his throat, his hands tightening into fists as he stared at the front page. A face he knew too well. A name he had tried to forget. A bounty. A warning. The men who had hunted him hadn't stopped looking. They had followed his trail, traced the whispers, dug into the places he had tried to disappear. They were coming. He tore the paper from the stand, stuffed it beneath his coat, and ran. The cold air sliced through him as he raced back to their apartment, his heart slamming against his ribs. He burst through the door, found Margaret in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour, her face soft with a rare moment of peace. The sight of her, so unaware, so full of quiet strength, made his chest tighten. He didn't want to break this moment, didn't want to drag her back into the fear they had fought so hard to escape. But he had no choice. "We have to go," he said, his voice rough, uneven. She turned, eyes wide, searching his face. "What happened?" He handed her the paper, watched as her hands trembled, as the blood drained from her face. "Henry," she breathed. "They won't stop." He shook his head. "They never do." A heavy silence stretched between them, thick with everything they couldn't say. Margaret clenched her jaw, her fingers crumpling the edges of the paper. "Then we don't run," she said, her voice fierce. "Not this time." He stared at her, his pulse thundering in his ears. "What are you saying?" She lifted her chin, fire blazing in her eyes. "I'm saying we fight." It was madness. It was suicide. But as he looked at her, at the woman who had stood by his side through every storm, who had never broken even when the world had tried to crush her, he felt something shift inside him. He had spent his whole life running. Maybe it was time to stop. Maybe it was time to stand. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Then we fight." The city stretched before them, cold and unforgiving, but they weren't afraid. Not anymore. The past had come for them, but they weren't the same people who had fled in the night, who had cowered in the shadows. They had survived too much, lost too much, to let fear win. And as they stood there, side by side, ready to face whatever came next, Henry knew one thing with absolute certainty. No matter what happened, they would face it together. Henry stood at the window, his breath fogging the cold glass as he watched the street below, scanning for signs of movement, for shadows that didn't belong. The city was never truly quiet. Even at this hour, the hum of distant traffic, the occasional bark of a stray dog, the laughter of men who had nothing to fear. He envied them, the ones who could walk freely without looking over their shoulders, without feeling the weight of eyes that judged, that hunted. Behind him, Margaret was moving through the small apartment with a steady purpose, gathering what little they had, her fingers quick but careful. There was no room for hesitation. They had done this before, packed in a rush, left without looking back. But this time, it felt different. This time, Margaret had said they wouldn't run. This time, they would fight. He turned to face her, watched the way her jaw clenched, the flicker of fire in her eyes even as her hands shook slightly when she buttoned her coat. She was afraid, he knew that, but fear had never stopped her before. It had never stopped either of them. He crossed the room in 3 steps, caught her wrist gently, feeling the way her pulse beat beneath his fingertips like a trapped bird. "We don't have to do this," he said, his voice low, careful, but she shook her head before he could say more. "Yes, we do," she whispered, meeting his gaze with something unbreakable. "I won't live like this, Henry. I won't spend my life running from ghosts that refuse to stay buried." He knew she was right, but knowing it didn't make it any easier. The men who were coming for them weren't just ghosts. They were flesh and blood, and they would not stop until they had what they wanted: revenge, power, the satisfaction of knowing that the world had not changed as much as people liked to believe. He thought about what had brought them here, about the years of hiding, the jobs taken in the shadows, the nights spent in fear. He thought about the South, about the heat of Mississippi, the dirt roads that had once been home, but had never truly belonged to him, not in the way they should have. He thought about the men who had killed his father, who had burned his childhood home, who had sent him running before he was old enough to understand what he was running from. He thought about the first time he saw Margaret, the way she had looked at him like he was something more than the world said he could be. And he thought about now, about the weight of this moment, about the choice that had already been made. There was no turning back. A knock at the door sent a bolt of ice through his veins. Too soon. It was too soon. They weren't ready. Margaret's fingers found his, squeezed once before letting go. He stepped toward the door, his hand hovering near the small knife he kept in his coat pocket, useless against a gun, but comforting all the same. Another knock, firmer this time. He took a breath, forced his face into something neutral, and cracked the door open just enough to see the man standing outside. Not one of them. At least, not yet. It was Elijah. His heart stuttered. He hadn't seen Elijah in over a year, not since they had last moved, not since the night Henry had left him bleeding in an alley after a deal gone wrong, after a betrayal that had nearly cost them both their lives. Elijah's eyes flicked to Henry's hands, to the tension in his shoulders, and he gave a slow nod. "They're coming," he said, his voice quiet, urgent. "You don't have much time." Henry exhaled sharply, stepped aside to let him in, locking the door behind him. Margaret was already watching, wary but calm. "How do you know?" she asked. Elijah hesitated, ran a hand over his face. "Because I led them here," he admitted, and the world tilted sideways. Henry moved before he could think, before he could stop himself, shoving Elijah back against the wall, his fist gripping the fabric of his coat. "You son of a... I didn't have a choice." Elijah gasped, eyes wide with something close to desperation. "They had my sister, Henry. They had her and I..." His voice cracked, and Henry felt the fight drain out of him, just a little. Elijah had never been a good man, but he wasn't a monster either. He was just another man trying to survive in a world that didn't make space for people like them. He let go, stepped back. How long do we have? Elijah swallowed hard, rubbing his throat. An hour, maybe less. They're watching the station, the bus depot. If you try to run, they'll be waiting. Margaret's fingers tightened around the handle of her bag. Then what do we do? Henry looked at her, then at Elijah, then back at the door, at the world waiting outside, sharpening its teeth. There was only one answer. We end this. The words settled heavy in the air. Margaret nodded once, her face set. Elijah hesitated, then sighed. I was afraid you'd say that. They didn't have much. A pistol with only a few bullets, a knife, a plan held together by desperation, but they had something more than that. They had each other. And sometimes, that was enough. The next hour moved like molasses and lighting all at once, time slipping between their fingers as they prepared, as they braced themselves for what was coming. They chose their ground. A narrow alley near the docks, a place where the city's noise swallowed everything whole, where no one would ask questions when the screaming started. And then they waited. The first man arrived just after midnight, a silhouette cut against the streetlight, his step slow, deliberate. He wasn't alone. They never were. Henry tensed, fingers curling around the grip of the pistol. He could feel Margaret beside him, steady, unshaken. Elijah exhaled softly, a prayer or a curse, maybe both. And then, all at once, the night shattered. The first shot rang out like thunder, then another. Shadows surged forward, boots scraping against pavement, voices raised in anger, in pain. Henry moved without thinking, without hesitation, his body a machine of survival, of instinct. A fist caught his jaw, sent stars bursting behind his eyes, but he didn't fall. He fired once, twice, felt the burn of something sharp slicing across his arm. Margaret was there, her knife flashing in the dark, Elijah fighting beside them, the three of them a storm against the men who had come to finish what they started. And then it was over. The alley was silent. The bodies lay still. Henry was breathing hard, blood warm on his skin, not all of it his own. Margaret was looking at him, her chest rising and falling, her knife still clutched in her hand. Elijah wiped his mouth, spit blood onto the pavement. Well, he panted, that was dramatic. Henry laughed, sharp and breathless. They had done it. Against the odds, against the history that had been written for them, they had survived. For now. Margaret exhaled, glanced toward the open street. What now? Henry looked at her, then at Elijah, then at the city stretching beyond them. He thought of all the places they hadn't seen, all the roads they hadn't walked. He thought of the past, of the weight of it, and then he thought of the future. And for the first time in a long time, he let himself believe they had won. We go, he said simply, and we don't look back. And with that, they stepped into the night, into whatever came next. Together. The streets stretched before them like veins through the body of a city that had never truly been theirs, winding paths of danger and possibility, of ghosts and unfinished business, of escape routes that led to nowhere or to the next fight waiting just around the corner. The blood on Henry's shirt was beginning to cool, stiffening against his skin, but he barely felt it. His mind was already moving, scanning ahead, mapping out their next steps. Margaret walked close beside him, her breath steady but fast, her fingers still curled around the handle of the knife she had yet to let go of. Elijah trailed behind, rubbing the side of his jaw where a fist had landed hard, his face set in something unreadable, exhaustion or regret or just the quiet realization that none of them would ever truly be free. The city hummed around them, indifferent to what had just happened in that alleyway, to the bodies left cooling in the dark, to the history that had tried to crush them and failed, at least for now. A car rumbled past, headlights briefly flashing across their faces before disappearing into the night. They kept walking. Talking was dangerous right now. Words felt too heavy, too fragile, like breaking the silence would somehow wake the world back up and send it after them again. Henry led them down a narrow side street, past shuttered shops and closed diners, past the echoes of music spilling from bars where men laughed loudly, oblivious to the war that had just been waged only blocks away. They needed a place to regroup, to breathe, but nowhere felt safe. Not in this city. Not anywhere. "We can't stay here," Margaret murmured finally, as if reading his thoughts, and Henry nodded because she was right. She was always right. The men they had taken down wouldn't be the last. There were always more. "I have a place," Elijah said after a beat, his voice low, hesitant, as if even offering meant putting more weight on their backs, more risk, more blood. Henry looked at him, studied his face, the old scars, the new ones forming, the way his hands twitched slightly at his sides like a man who had learned to live in a constant state of readiness. He didn't trust him, not fully, not after everything, but trust was a luxury they couldn't afford right now. Survival wasn't about trust. It was about necessity. "Fine," Henry said, and that was that. They followed Elijah through back streets and side alleys, moving like shadows, moving like ghosts. The place he brought them to was a crumbling apartment building on the edge of the city, the kind of place where no one asked questions, where people came and went without names, without pasts, without futures. The stairs creaked under their weight as they climbed to the third floor, the hallway dimly lit by a single flickering bulb that buzzed like a trapped insect. Elijah unlocked the door to a small room that smelled of dust and cigarettes, the wallpaper peeling, the furniture sparse. Safe wasn't the right word for it, but it would do. Margaret dropped her bag onto the floor and leaned against the wall, closing her eyes just for a moment, just long enough to catch her breath. Henry sat on the edge of the bed, his body aching in ways he didn't have time to acknowledge. Elijah stood by the window, peering out through the tattered curtain, silent. The weight of the night settled over them, heavy, unshakable. "They won't stop," Margaret said finally, opening her eyes, her voice steady despite everything. "Not after this." Henry knew she was right. The men they had killed had friends, powerful ones, the kind that didn't let things go. Running wasn't an option anymore. Hiding wasn't enough. They would have to end it, really end it, or it would never be over. "Then we finish it," Henry said, the words tasting final, like fate. Margaret nodded. Elijah sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You know what that means, don't you?" he said, looking at them both, his voice heavy with something that felt like resignation, like knowing. Henry met his gaze, unflinching. "Yeah," he said. "I know." They would go back. Back to the heart of it. Back to the men who had started this war long before any of them had drawn their first breath. Back to the place Henry had sworn he would never return to. Mississippi. The name sat unspoken between them, thick in the air like smoke, like history reaching out its hands to drag them down. Elijah exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "We'll never make it out alive," he muttered, but he was already grabbing a cigarette from his pocket, already accepting what they all knew was inevitable. Henry stood, rolled his shoulders, shook off the exhaustion threatening to drag him under. "Then we make damn sure we take them with us," he said, and that was that. The next morning, they left before the city woke, before the world remembered to come looking for them. A bus would take them as far as Tennessee, then another, moving in pieces, in fragments, until they reached the place that had made them, the place that had broken them. Margaret sat beside him, her fingers laced with his, her grip firm. Elijah dozed against the window, his face unreadable even in sleep. The road stretched before them, long and uncertain, carrying them towards something final, something inevitable. And Henry, for the first time in years, wasn't afraid. Because no matter what waited for them at the end of this road, they weren't running anymore. They were coming back. And this time, they were ready. The bus rumbled down the highway, the wheels spinning over cracked asphalt, cutting through the dense morning fog as they neared their destination. Tennessee was just a dot in the distance, an abstract point on the map, but for Henry, it loomed like a specter, a memory alive with ghosts and hate. The air outside was sticky, heavy with the promise of a storm, the kind of storm that had once churned through his mind, only now, it felt like the kind of cleansing that could tear everything apart. Margaret's hand never left his. She was quiet, lost in her thoughts, but he could feel the tension in her fingers. They were both too aware of what was coming. There was no turning back now, no choice but to face it, to confront the legacy that had tied them all to this moment. Elijah was still asleep, his head tilted against the window, but Henry knew that even in his dreams, his mind was already at war with the past, the quiet war he'd fought in his soul ever since he'd left Mississippi. Henry's fingers curled around the seat in front of him, the anticipation gnawing at him, but his mind was also turning. He had no illusions about what would happen next. He could feel it in his gut, the final confrontation that would either break them all or force them to remake themselves. He could see the men who would be waiting for them, the faces he hadn't seen in years but never stopped remembering. The faces that haunted him, the ones who had betrayed him, who had tried to destroy him, and who now would do anything to finish what they had started. He had spent his life running from them, but now there was no more distance, no more hiding. They were right in front of him. He closed his eyes, taking in a breath, feeling the weight of what was to come. Margaret was staring out the window now, her expression unreadable. He wanted to ask her if she was scared, but he knew the answer. They were both scared. They had been since the moment they decided to come back here. But fear wasn't what drove them. It never had been. It was something deeper, something fiercer: revenge, justice, survival, and the need to leave a mark on a history that had tried to erase them. In the silence, Henry heard the distant rumble of thunder, the storm on the horizon finally making itself known. As the bus turned onto the final stretch toward the Mississippi border, he felt his heart quicken. Every mile closer to the place that had formed him, that had shaped him in ways he could never fully understand, felt like the ground was slipping beneath his feet, like the whole world was trembling. The sun had begun to rise as they neared their destination, casting a soft orange glow over the fields they passed. It felt too peaceful, too serene for what lay ahead. Henry could already see it, the town in the distance, the place that had molded his past, a place that would now force him to confront everything he had tried to forget. The bus stopped at a small station, the kind that only locals would recognize, the kind that still felt untouched by time. Henry stood first, his legs stiff from the long ride, and he helped Margaret down before they turned to Elijah. His face was drawn, weary, but his eyes held something else, something dark, something hungry. "This is it," he said quietly. "The place where it all started." Margaret glanced at the horizon, and then back at Henry, her gaze unwavering. "We knew this was coming." Henry nodded. "It's time." They didn't speak again as they began the slow walk toward the center of town. There was no need for words. The past was already there, waiting for them, and nothing they said could change the course of what was inevitable. The streets of the town were quiet, too quiet for a place so full of ghosts, but Henry knew that even in the silence, the tension was building. He could feel it in the way the buildings loomed over them, in the way the air seemed to hold its breath, as if it were waiting for the explosion that was sure to come. They made their way to the old building, the one that had once served as the meeting place for the men who had orchestrated his downfall, and now it felt like the heart of everything he had ever feared. The doors creaked open, and Henry stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. The place was dark, the air thick with dust, but he knew what was coming. He could hear the sounds of voices, low, murmuring, growing louder as they approached the room at the end of the hall. The men were here. The men who had tried to bury him, to bury his people, to bury everything they stood for. He could feel the rage building inside him, a force so powerful it threatened to break free. And then, as they turned the corner, the door to the room slammed open, and the faces he had once known stared back at him, some familiar, some foreign, but all of them full of the same hatred, the same power that had once crushed him. "Well, well," one of them sneered, a man with a face lined by years of cruelty. Look who finally decided to show up. Henry's heart pounded in his chest, but his voice was calm, colder than he felt. I'm not here for small talk. I'm here to finish what we started. The tension in the room was palpable, like the air before a storm, and Henry could see the flicker of uncertainty in the eyes of the men who had once thought themselves untouchable. They had underestimated him then, but not anymore. You've got nothing left, the man said, his voice low, trying to assert dominance, but Henry wasn't intimidated. He stepped forward, his chest rising with the kind of defiance that came from knowing he had nothing more to lose. You're wrong, he said, his voice steady, filled with the certainty of someone who had already made peace with the inevitable. I've got everything left. And then the door behind him slammed open, and the sound of more footsteps filled the room. Margaret and Elijah stood there, ready, their eyes filled with the same resolve. This was the moment they had been waiting for. This was the end of the line. The end of the fight. The fight to reclaim their lives. The fight to make sure history remembered their names. The fight to take back what had always been theirs. The battle for justice was here, and nothing, not even the weight of history itself, could stop them now. The room fell silent as the men realized what was happening. No longer would they be the ones to decide who lived and who died, who had a future and who did not. Henry stepped forward, and with each step, he felt the world around him tremble. It wasn't just the past they were fighting anymore. It was the future. Their future. And no matter what happened next, he knew they would leave a mark that could never be erased. The air inside the room grew thick, a heavy silence settling as the tension between them all felt unbearable. Henry stood there, his back straight, his hands clenched at his sides, facing the men who had once tried to break him, the ones who believed they could dictate his fate, his life, and his future. They had made their choices, their decisions, but Henry had made his long ago. He wasn't here to beg. He wasn't here to plead. He was here to reclaim what had always been his, the right to stand, the right to breathe, the right to live as a man in this world, no matter how much they tried to take it from him. The men in the room exchanged glances, their arrogance faltering as they saw the unwavering resolve in his eyes. He knew that this was the moment that could change everything. There would be no more hiding. There would be no more walking away. The truth had come to this place, and it would not be silenced. The room was stifling, the air too heavy for comfort, but Henry's heart pounded with a ferocity that could not be extinguished. His gaze moved to the man who had once led the charge against him, a figure who had always believed he was untouchable, a man who thought his legacy would never be questioned. The man's face had aged, hardened by time and regret, but there was still that coldness in his eyes, the same coldness that had once cast its shadow over Henry's life. You should have stayed away, the man said, his voice low, almost a hiss, as though the words were poison slipping from his lips. Henry shook his head slowly, his expression unyielding. No, I should have never left. I should have stayed and fought, long before it came to this. Margaret and Elijah stood by his side, a quiet solidarity between them, their eyes never wavering from the men before them. They were here together, for a reason that ran deeper than any one individual. It was a fight not just for Henry, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, for everyone who had been silenced, whose dignity had been trampled, whose life had been taken in small, brutal increments by a system that sought to destroy them. Henry took a slow breath, every ounce of his being focused on the man who had tried to break him. You took everything from me, Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper, but it carried with a power that filled the room. You stole my childhood, you destroyed my family, you tried to erase my future. But you failed. And now, I'm standing here. Not because of your cruelty, but in spite of it. The man sneered, stepping forward with a look of disdain, but Henry didn't move an inch. The power shifted in that room, just a little, but it was enough. You don't understand, the man said, his voice trembling slightly. You can't just come back here and undo everything that's been done. You can't change the past. Henry shook his head. No, but I can change the future. The silence grew thicker, heavier. The other men in the room looked at one another, uncertainty creeping into their features. They had known Henry as a boy. They had known him as a victim, someone broken by the weight of a system built to destroy him. But what they hadn't counted on was the strength he had found over the years. What they hadn't counted on was the fire that had ignited in him, a fire that refused to be snuffed out. The moment stretched out, and then the door swung open behind them, and more men entered the room, people Henry had not seen in years. They were black men and women, some young, some old, but all with the same fire in their eyes, the same sense of purpose. "We're here too," one of the men said, his voice steady but full of resolve. "And we're not leaving without what's ours." Henry turned to face them, a feeling of deep relief flooding him. They were not alone. They had never been alone. This fight had always been bigger than any one person, any one story. This was the reckoning, the truth, coming to claim what it had long been denied. The man who had spoken before looked back at his companions, their faces hardening as they realized the depth of what was happening. "You think you can just rewrite history?" one of them spat. "You think you can come in here and change everything?" Henry met the man's eyes without flinching. "No," he said, his voice clear and strong. "I'm not here to rewrite history. I'm here to make sure it's remembered. And I'm here to make sure you can't forget it." A tense silence settled again, but this time it felt different. The room, which had once felt oppressive and full of power, now felt small, constrained. The wall seemed to close in on the men who had once ruled it, their dominance slipping away like sand through their fingers. The weight of what they had done hung heavy in the air, a burden they could no longer escape. Margaret stepped forward, her voice calm but carrying the authority of someone who had fought her whole life. "The time for silence is over," she said, her eyes moving from one man to the next. "The time for pretending that what was done can be ignored is over. You can't erase the past, but you can stop trying to destroy the future." For the first time, the men who had once held a power looked unsure. The doubt in their eyes was palpable. They had expected resistance, but not like this, not the kind of resistance that was backed by truth, by solidarity, by a force far stronger than their hatred. "What do you want?" one of the men finally asked, his voice weak now. Henry stood taller, his chest filling with air as he spoke, his words steady and unwavering. "What I want is simple. I want justice. I want the truth to come out, all of it. I want you to answer for what you've done, for the lives you've ruined, for the future you've stolen. And I want to make sure that no one else has to suffer because of your lies." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, and Henry could see it, the shift. The men who had once been so sure of themselves were crumbling before his eyes. They were realizing that the power they had held for so long had never been as strong as they thought. The room was no longer theirs. It never had been. It was theirs now, the people's, Henry's. He looked at Margaret and Elijah, both of them standing tall beside him, and he knew, in that moment, that they were not just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, for everyone who had ever been crushed under the weight of a system that tried to erase them. "It's time for change," Henry said, his voice firm, resolute. "Time for you to answer for what you've done." The men in the room couldn't look away. The truth had finally come for them, and there was no hiding, no running, no escaping. It was here, and nothing would ever be the same. As the doors slammed shut behind them, Henry felt a quiet strength in his chest. They had done it. They had made their stand. The road ahead was uncertain, the future still clouded with doubt, but in that moment, they had reclaimed something far more important than justice. They had reclaimed their dignity. And that, at the very least, was a victory.